showing up this morning to chant psalms, you brave souls. It's really a privilege for me to share with you today. And when Jeremiah first started talking about this enduring practices, these sessions throughout Lent, I just thought, oh, that's so fitting, such a wonderful thing to be doing. And psalm chanting was the first thing that popped into my head, so I said, please, can I do this? And he graciously agreed. And I think it's going to be a really wonderful framework for those of you who are able to make it to several of these other sessions, particularly those last two. I think the way that we encounter the Psalms today through chant, as opposed to just reading them to ourselves or hearing them spoken. To me, there's a lot of alignment there with something like Lectio Divina as a different way of encountering the text, and also with the use of our breath as a different way of really aligning ourselves in prayer. So the Psalms are such a weighty part of our scripture, such a weighty part of our tradition and our heritage. And you probably notice the more that you read the Psalms and the more that you come to our liturgy, that the Psalms are woven throughout many of the liturgies of the Anglican Church and the Historic Church. And so they've been a really enduring part of our worship, throughout Judaism and throughout Christianity. And I just wanted to start us off today with a quote from a book by Tim Keller on the Psalms that I think will give us a good context for what we're entering into today. He says, "In calling Psalms medicine, I am trying to do justice to what makes them somewhat different from other parts of the Bible. They are written to be prayed, recited, and sung, to be done, not merely to be read." Theologian David Wenham concludes that using them repeatedly is a performative act that alters one's relationship with God in a way mere listening does not. We are, in a sense, to put them inside our own prayers, or perhaps to put our prayers inside them and approach God in that way. And my own experience with psalm chanting, I'll put it out there right away. I'm not an expert in this area. I'm largely self-taught, but I've had the privilege of serving in some parishes where psalm chanting was part of the tradition, and I learned a lot on the job in those roles. And my own experience with that has really been that to use your breath in that way and to encounter the text through singing rather than through just reading it really is a formative process. And so I love that word of viewing chanting the Psalms as a performative act, and formative is part of that word, performative, right? And so this is it's really a process that takes place within us as we encounter it. So if you have your handouts there, you can just follow along, and I'm going to give us a little bit more context of why do we do this, where did this crazy practice come from, and then we'll jump in and we're going to spend the bulk of our time today actually learning how to do this and chanting some psalms together. But I wanted to give you a little bit of the historic and liturgical basis for psalm chanting. So obviously the psalmists wrote the psalms as music. We know that they were songs. Initially, we don't really know what that sounded like today, but we do know that this was handed down as music. And throughout Jewish temple worship and synagogue worship, there was a process of chanting that developed called cantillation. And so cantillation was a form of chant that essentially there were markings over the text that showed you how to inflect your voice. And there were different tunes that were learned by rote and passed along. And those were basically, you could use the text in the oral tradition to learn how to chant this text. And that helped with memorization as well, since the Psalms were largely memorized. And it's widely assumed by scholars that the early Christians kind of took that same practice and carried it on, and that grew and developed over time. So that is our framework from the composition into the early church. And then we can see in early Christian worship, St. Paul mentions in several of his epistles singing psalms, singing scriptural hymns. By the 2nd century, we have Tertullian writing about the psalms being sung as part of the worship service, as part of the liturgy in connection with communion and other scripture reading. And then by the 4th century, we have writings from St. Jerome, who also talks about early monastic life and the singing of all of the psalms. And by the time of St. Benedict in the 6th century, the psalms were in a weekly cycle. So all of the psalms, all 150, were being chanted by the monastic communities every week. So you have to be a monastic, I would submit, to make that work in your life. But we do have a tradition in our own Anglican heritage of having the Psalms be read through or chanted through on a monthly cycle. And you can find in the Book of Common Prayer an actual layout for how to do that. And I would submit that that may be a really wonderful Lenten practice, especially as you settle into chanting. It's a wonderful way to encounter the Psalms differently during the season that we're entering into today. So I want to talk briefly about different forms of chanting, because when I say chant, you probably have a lot of different things come to your mind. Most of us have heard of Gregorian chant, whether or not we know what it is. And so I just wanted to give us a little bit of a setting of what are these different forms of chant and what are we actually going to be doing today? What do we actually encounter the most in a church setting? So we have plain song chant, which is basically, it's a liturgical music that's sung on a single melody. It's got a free-flowing rhythm that matches the text. So chant is always to serve the text. You don't learn a particular song, like we might learn a modern worship song that's based on a psalm, but you're actually using the text of the psalm, and the chant develops around that and fits around that. And I'll show you how that works as we get a little further into it. No musical accompaniment to plain song chant. And basically, until the 9th century, every type of chant was plain song. Gregorian chant, which we're probably more familiar with as a term, is a type of plain song chant. It was developed in the 8th century, and we're not totally sure of all the history, but very likely this was actually a commission project. So different geographical regions and different church traditions had developed their own varieties of plain song chant. And there was a big push in the 8th century to start to organize things a little bit more and get everybody on a uniform page and be able to just have more cohesion in different forms of worship. And so likely this was done basically by committee and on commission, and they took several of the dominant stylistic forms of chanting in that time from various regions, and there's an overlay of the ancient Greek modal system, if you're musical and familiar with that, to develop what we call the church modes today, and Gregorian chant was born out of that. And over several years, Gregorian chant came to be really the only form of chant that was used. So we know a little bit about other forms and regional styles of plain song chant. We don't know that much about other forms besides Gregorian. So it has really become the dominant form. And that's what we're going to be exploring today. So if Gregorian chant has sounded like something only professional musicians can do, that's not true. You can do it too, and we're going to do it today. But I wanted to also talk about Anglican chant, because you're at an Anglican church today, and Anglican chant is related but a little bit different, and it's not what we're going to be jumping into today, and I'll explain why. It's a little bit more complex than Gregorian or plain song chant. It usually involves multiple parts, so you've got a full choir singing, and there are, the melodies can be a little bit more expansive, and there's just a little bit more musical sense that goes into that learning process. It can be accompanied by instruments, not always, it doesn't have to be, but quite often in churches you'll see it accompanied by organ or piano. And it has a little bit more of a rhythmic pulse to it, so it still fits the text, but there's just a little bit more, like I said, musical sense that you may want to have going into it. But I do want to encourage you that the Gloria that we've been chanting together in services throughout the season of Epiphany that we just ended with last week is actually a style of Anglican chant. So if that helps you to kind of center, what is that? What does it sound like? That's what we've been doing. So if you're doing that over weeks with some leadership, it's not very hard to get into. And Gregorian chant is actually easier to get into. So if that didn't feel too scary to you over several weeks, this should be a little bit easier. And the last category is called proper chant, which is where you actually have a melody that's composed to go along with the text all the way through, but it doesn't have a lot of repetition to it, and so you really just need to learn the whole thing by rote. And we won't be doing any of that today, but there are some really beautiful proper chants. A lot of them are settings for our canticles that we have throughout our worship services. So those are our different forms of chanting. Now we get to the exciting part, and I want to devote the rest of our time together to actually using our voices and using our breath and learning how to do this. So we're going to start with just a little bit of warming up and and you do not need to have any singing or musical background or confidence to be able to do this. I was reading in a book I have about psalm chanting. The author is a professional musician and spent quite a while with a monastery as a sort of sabbatical, and was chanting the psalms regularly throughout the day with the monks, and having a wonderful time as a musician, encountering this really rich tradition. And one of the brothers pulled her aside at one point and said very gently, "If you can hear yourself above your neighbors, you're probably singing too loud." And I thought that was a great encouragement, not just for those of us who are more musically inclined and enjoy the singing process and like to project, but for those of us who may be a little bit more timid as well. The goal really is to have a unified voice here and to engage strongly with the text. And so don't worry at all about how you sound, but we're just gonna give this a go. And so I wanted to start with the breath because that is the foundation for all of our singing, for all of our chant. And I wanted to start with just some deep breathing. So if you can, if you're not already, just sit up nice and tall in your chair. If you want to roll your shoulders a little and loosen up any tension. And if your feet can be flat on the floor, that's a wonderful foundation for your breath to work smoothly. And we're just going to start with a few deep breaths from our stomach. Breathe in through your nose and try to breathe all the way down, filling your lungs. We don't want our shoulders to be hunching up with our breath here, but you want to be breathing down almost into the pit of your stomach. And then release that out through your mouth. So let's just take a few moments at your own pace with your own breath, and we'll breathe in and out together. Just getting a feel for your own breath. I'm excited for Deacon Jeremiah's Enduring Practices workshop because a lot of us spend a lot of time not breathing very deeply, and so this may be the first deep breath you've taken today. So just take a moment and settle into that. To begin connecting our voices to our breath, we're going to continue that deep breathing, but we're going to start to synchronize to each other. And we're just going to, as we breathe out, just hum whatever note comes to you. Doesn't matter if you match up with your neighbors or not, but just to start letting your voice carry out on your breath and feeling that connection of your voice to your breath. So let's do that together. You made it. Now we're going to continue that. You sound lovely, and we're going to change from a hum to an ah sound. So just let your mouth fall open and try to let your throat be open as well to let that breath just freely travel all the way out into the room. Let's continue that breathing. Excellent. Are you ready to chant your first psalm? All right, let's do it. So you see what Psalm 100, just the text there on your page, much as we would see it in our bulletins for Sunday reading. And we're going to start with the very simplest form of chant, which is monotone. So we're just going to stay on one pitch. Here we do want to be on the same pitch together in the room to make a unified voice. So I'll set our pitch for us, but we're just going to stay on that pitch and basically just read this through, but on a single tone instead. All right, so let's start with this pitch. And here we go together. Oh, be joyful in the Lord, all you lands. Serve the Lord with gladness, and come before his presence with a song. Be assured that the Lord, he is God. It is he that has made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people, and the sheep
sheep of his pasture. Oh, go your way into his gates with thanksgiving, and into his courts with praise. Be thankful unto him, and speak good of his name. For the Lord is gracious, his mercy is everlasting, and his truth endures from generation to generation.
Beautiful. So you guys just chanted your first song. I got so excited. That sounded fantastic, and I love that corporate sense, right? It just pulls us all together wonderfully. So I read something recently that just made me chuckle, which was monotone chanting is the easiest, most accessible form, but it gets a little monotonous, right? And so that's not very exciting. If that's all I left you with today, I think you would be like, oh, I don't think chanting the Psalms is for me. So we're going to start to get into these actual ways of inflecting our voice and see how that lines up with the Psalm. So we're actually going to stick with Psalm 100, and we're going to chant it through one more time, but this time we're going to be looking for the strong syllable at the end of each line. So the first line ends where the asterisk is. So that first line, oh, be joyful in the Lord, all you lands. On lands, because that's a strong syllable, we're going to raise our voices up. So it will go, oh, be joyful in the Lord, all you lands. And we'll do that all together. And then on the second half of the verse, serve the Lord with gladness and come before his presence with a song. Song is another strong syllable. So we're going to drop our voices on that one. So we'll have a rise and then a fall, and that will, the end of that line will sound like this. Come before his presence with a song. So I'll lead that. I'll stay on mic for that so you can hear what that pitch is, because we're starting to get a very simple tone, psalm tone, orally. And this is an oral tradition. So you don't need to worry about being able to read music at all. You're just going to follow along, and so you've got it in your ear, and then we'll continue that together throughout the psalm. So let's start that again on this pitch. Here we go.
Oh, be joyful in the Lord, all you lands. Serve the Lord with gladness, and come before his presence with a song. Be assured that the Lord, he is God. It is he that has made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people, and the sheep of his pasture. Oh, go your way into his gates with thanksgiving, and into his courts with praise. Be thankful unto him, and speak good of his name. For the Lord is gracious, his mercy is everlasting, and his truth endures from generation to generation.
Wonderful. So I heard pastor at verse 2 threw a lot of people off because pass is the strong syllable of that word. And so that's where we move. But we had that happen several times through verses 3 and 4, and a lot of you seem to be catching on to that. So that is one part of psalm chanting. If you're just using a text without any sort of text pointing or marking to it, that you have to sort of figure that out on your own. It gets way easier the more you do it. So I'll just say, don't be discouraged if they all throw you off, those weak syllables. It gets easier. And most of our psalters and the examples we're using today actually show you where to move your voice in the text. So we're going to get into that. If you'll turn the page in your handout to the anatomy of a psalm tone. This may be something you've seen before and not known what you were looking at. It may be completely new to you, but that music that's written across the top of the page is a really helpful thing to see, even if you don't read music, because it shows you each part of an actual psalm melody. So this is a little bit more complex than what we just did with one note up and one note down. There's a couple extra notes in there, but it's actually not very complicated at all. So I'll sing to you what it sounds like in just a moment, but I want to actually go through what are all the different parts called. It's helpful to have some vocabulary as we go through. So you'll see, if you don't read music, you'll just see that we have the notes across the page, and there's clearly 3 separate sections, right? We've got a vertical line, that's called a bar line, dividing these different sections from each other. So in that first section, before you get to the 2 bar lines, that's called the intonation, and that is just used at the beginning of the first verse. So you'll only hear that one time at the beginning of a psalm. It can be skipped. Sometimes people skip that for ease. So if you feel like, I'm not really sure, I want to just start on a single tone, that's perfectly acceptable. But those kind of help it just to put us in the musical world that we're going to be inhabiting. They give us a sense of scale and a sense of pitch. And so often you'll just hear those sung by one person at the beginning as you introduce the first verse. Then we get to a box-looking note, and that's called the reciting tone. So that would be the note that we just started Psalm 100 on and stayed on until the end of each line. That's called the reciting tone, and most of the verses is sung on that reciting tone. Most of the syllables just stay steady on that pitch, so that's the monotone part of our chant. And then after the box, we see a couple of notes or dots. And one is a little bit higher, and then one is in parentheses, back lower, and then we have an open one after that. So that set of notes together is called the mediant, or sometimes called the mediation, and that is the ending of the first half of the verse. So for us, what we just chanted together, the mediant would be just the one note that what we sang higher at the end of each line, right? So we're going to learn a little bit more complex of a version of that. But a lot of medians are that simple. You just go up one note and then maybe come right back down to your reciting tone. So then we have another bar line, and in the text, we always see an asterisk, right? The fancy chant word for the asterisk is the caesura. We can just call it the asterisk, that's fine. But caesura, think of the word to cease, right? It is meant to be in chant a significant pause at the middle of the verse. You're meant to have enough space there to get a good leisurely full breath and not feel like you're rushing on to the next thing. And it's also a wonderful opportunity to reflect on the text that you were just chanting through, and to look ahead a little bit and plan out musically how you're going to approach, notice strong syllables and things like that as you go through the next. So that's probably the hardest part I find in being new to chanting, is actually we're used to just continuing to read on quickly. And we want to make sure that we're taking a lot of space there for meditation as well as for our breath. And so I'll be leading us and just reminding us to take a significant pause whenever we reach an asterisk at the half verse. And then we have another reciting tone, and it's the same one. You'll see it's on the same line of the musical staff there. And so you're just going to return to your reciting tone as we did in Psalm 100. And then we have 4 more notes following that, which is called the termination. And so that for us would be when we just dropped down a note with our voices at the end of the full verse, right? So we really just sang a psalm tone. It's just a very simplified version of one. Now we're going to actually get into talking about some of the different forms of notation. So we can dive into this. Whether or not you read music, it's not important. It's still helpful to be able to see when those notes go up and down, because they're really just meant to be a memory jog for a tune that you learn orally. So I'm going to teach you a few of those tunes orally today to get you started, and I'll put you to some resources that you can learn others. So you really don't need to be able to read music at all to dive into that. If you have seen scans or maybe online, if you've seen pictures of medieval music, you know it's medieval music because it doesn't look like our modern music, right? It's got a lot of square dots instead of our more modern round dots. You may notice the staff only has 4 lines instead of 5. And so there are a lot of differences between medieval music and our modern notation. But that medieval music is called pneumatic. We're not going to go a lot into that today, but I have included a few examples of pneumatic psalms through your packet that we'll encounter. And the important thing to know, especially if you are musical and you do read music, is that the notes on a pneumatic staff are not exact pitches. So they don't tell you exactly the way our modern staff does. Oh, middle C goes here, and that's treble G on that line. Those sorts of things. They're really just meant to show the direction of the melody as it rises and falls. and there are other symbols that go along with it to give you some sense of rhythm and when to take a breath and those sorts of things. But the reason that chant developed around that is because it's really just meant to be sort of a memory jog of something that you have already learned. Our modern stuff, we have a lot of psalters today, and what we'll be using a lot of is showing the psalms notated out on the modern stuff. So that anatomy of a psalm tone that we just looked through is a very modernized way of writing it out. It's very helpful if you do read music and you want to be able to pick out the melody and teach it to yourself orally. That's how I learned most of the psalm tones. And I don't think it's actually the best way to learn it, because you tend to get a little more analytical and try to match up, the lines exactly to the music notes that you know, and it can set you in a particular key, which may not fit very well with your voice. But it can be a helpful way if you just want to pick it out a few times on an instrument and teach yourself how the tune goes. But I'd encourage you, if you are musical and you try that at home, just to learn the melody and then trust your ear and find your own internal sense of what pitch suits your voice the best, because it's really about being able to sing it true and not be stuck in a particular tone or be analytical about the music. Right? And then I wanted to talk briefly about some of the symbols that we're going to be encountering as we look through the next several pages. So what we just looked at the top of your anatomy of a psalm tone page, I showed you the intonation is in that separate box. It's often shown that way, but sometimes, especially in that more pneumatic medieval notation, it won't appear separate. It'll just be the first 2 or 3 notes leading up to your reciting tone. That reciting tone may be shown as that box-like note. It can be shown sometimes as a whole note in music or a double whole note, or sometimes it's just shown as several notes on the same line to show you that that's the repeating tone. It happens a whole bunch of times. And then your mediant and your termination are usually shown by some sort of hash mark. So again, the example that we looked at, you can see there's lines underneath some of those notes, and that's showing you when it's time to move away from that common pitch that we've been staying on the whole time and to either go up or down or do whatever the tune requires of your voice. So looking out for those marks helps you know where you're going with your voice. And then in the text, we'll be seeing several examples where you can actually, you're not looking for the strong syllable on your own. Editors have gone through and marked up the text to show you when to move your voice. Super helpful, especially when you're chanting in a group, so you don't all just go off in different directions going, no, that's the strong syllable. No, I think it's this one over here. Because there are actually different ways of interpreting what's the important point where your voice should be moving away, and how many syllables follow after that point to match up with the rest of the tune that you're working with. So go ahead and turn your page, and you'll see on the next page that we have 2 versions of Psalm 82. And I picked these because, first of all, the top version is actually the psalm tone that we use to chant our psalms in the service throughout Lent. So when we actually go upstairs and go into our service today, instead of speaking our psalms back and forth, we will be chanting them together. And I thought you guys are all going to get a head start, and you'll be so smart, and you'll be able to lead the rest of the congregation in knowing this psalm tone. And I think that should also be an encouragement to you if you've been here in past years. You've already heard this psalm tone and you've already chanted it. And it's not hard. It's a very, very simple one. The mediant, that first melody where we change away from the reciting tone, just goes up 1 note and then comes back if there's an extra syllable after the strong one to the same note that you started on. So it's basically the same as what we did for Psalm 100, except that if we have more weak syllables, we're going to come back down again. So we'll see that in the very first line of the psalm. And then instead of just going down 1 pitch, we're going to go down 2 pitches and then rise back up a little bit at the end. So that's a lot of explanation. It's going to make a lot of sense. If it's not clicking right now, as we start doing it, you'll go, oh, that's really easy, what she just explained. So let's take a look at the first line. God stands in the council of princes. And you can see that the first part of princes is bold. So that's our strong syllable. We're going to rise up there. So it'll be, God stands in the council of princes. And we come back down to our reciting tone on the weaker syllable there. So let's just try that, starting all together. That's probably pitched a little bit high for you guys. So let's do,
God stands in the council of princes.
Excellent. So you guys are going to be pros at this. And then the second half, our termination, sounds like this. Do, 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 do. That may sound familiar from previous Lents. And the way that's going to fit up with the second half of our verse is, He is a judge among gods. So you can see there's two bolts on that line to show you where to start moving down, and then where to land on that final note. And then if you've got syllables in between there, they fall in those in-between notes. So let's try that second half of the verse. He is a judge among gods, all together.
He is a judge among gods.
Excellent. So we're going to put that whole first verse together now, and just a reminder and encouragement when you reach the asterisk, the caesura, let yourself take a nice deep breath there. It's okay to have a long pause. It's not an awkward silence. It's a time to meditate on what we are reading and chanting together. So let's start that out all together on that same pitch.
God stands in the council of princes. He is a judge among gods.
Fantastic. So I'm going to start us off on that verse one more time, and then we're going to try out the whole psalm since you've got such a good start. But what I'm going to do this time is add the intonation. So that intonation is in that first box of music, and it's just a few notes that kind of lead us up to the reciting tone. It always lands on the reciting tone, and it just gives us a little bit more of a sense of what some of the other notes are that we'll encounter in the chant. And so that sounds like, God stands in the council of princes. So you can hear that just gives us a little bit more musical context for our ears to latch onto. So I'm going to do that again. If you got that right away, you can feel free to join me on the intonation. Otherwise, join in on the reciting tone when we reach the council. We'll be on the same pitch all together. And we're going to just keep going this time and sort of feel our way out through the psalm, and you'll feel how it gets way more comfortable as we actually start to engage with this. So here we go.
God stands in the council of princes. He is a judge among gods. How long will you give wrong judgment and accept the ungodly? Defend the poor and fatherless. See that those who are in need and necessity have what is right. Deliver the outcast and poor. Save them from the hand of the ungodly. They will not learn nor understand, but walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I have said you are gods, and you are all the children of the Most High. But you shall die like mortals, and fall like one of the princes. Arise, O God, and judge the earth, for you shall take all nations for your inheritance.
Great. That was really, really wonderful, you guys. So good job with your first Gregorian psalm tone, a little bit more complex than what we did, but not too hard. And I think especially as we do that tone throughout Lent, you'll become really comfortable with it. If you start with one tone, this is the simplest one to start with. And if that's all you use and you want to try chanting through the entire Psalter just with that one tone, that's a beautiful practice to do and a great way to get started, and you can always build on that in the future. Before we move on, Deacon Jeremiah, can I get a quick time check from you, because I did not bring any sort of timekeeper with me? Thank you. All right, let's take a look at the same psalm on the lower half of that page. And the reason I chose the same psalm again is because we're actually going to encounter that with a different tone this time. And we can see that we have that pneumatic way of writing out the psalm tones. So if you do read music, you may look at that and feel a little bit more lost. If you don't read music, you're probably like, what difference does this make to me? Again, we're meant to just see the rise and the fall of the melody here and to learn the tune orally. So I'm going to sing through the tune just on a lot so we can get it in our ears. And you may notice some familiarities to the one we just chanted, as well as some differences because it is a different tone. So with the intonation, here's what it sounds like. La 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 la. So that beginning, the intonation and the mediation are exactly the same as the one we just did, and it's only at the end that the tone changes. And that different ending was la 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 la. So it goes down and then rises back up. It sounds a little bit more cheerful, right? So it's really wonderful to have some different chants in our repertoire, different tones, so that we can encounter the text. And especially with so many psalms encompassing so many different feelings and emotions, I think it's really nice to have some different tones to match up to them. It can also be a really wonderful practice when you know a few tones to try chanting the same psalm through different tones. So you'll see as we chant this one, how it has a different feel to it than the way that we just encountered the same text. And as you take those long breaths, give that a little bit of consideration of how, am I noticing something a little different in the text here maybe than I did before because our setting is different. So we're just going to jump right in and try this one together, and you can listen, I'll stay on mic, so as you start to get more of a feel for that ending being different, we'll come in all together on it. Here we go. God standeth in the congregation of princes. He is a judge among us. How long will ye get wrong judgment and accept the persons of the ungodly? Defend the poor and fatherless. See that such as are in need and necessity have right. Deliver the outcast and poor. Save them from the hand of the ungodly. They know not, neither do they understand, but walk on still in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are out of course. I have said ye are gods, and ye are all the children of the Most Highest. But ye shall die like men, and fall like one of the princes. Arise, O God, and judge thou the earth, for thou shalt take all nations to thine inheritance. I like hearing how the first couple verses are a little squidgy at the end of the lines there, and by the last verse we're all really coming together wonderfully. All right, I was under no apprehensions that we would make it through all of the examples today, but I wanted to include a lot for your further exploration, and we'll see, depending on our questions, we may have time to squeeze one or two more in. Before we move on to our question time though, just turn to the very back of your handout there, because I wanted to walk you through some further resources, since our time today is so limited and there's only so much that you can learn together in 40 minutes. There are a lot of really great resources here, whether you feel that you're musical or not, whether you have an easier time looking at written out music and teaching yourself, or you just need to hear something 50 times and then try it yourself. That very first link there is actually just a quick recap and overview of what we learned today with some examples by an Anglican priest. And so there's a wonderful little, I think less than 15-minute YouTube video there if you're like, oh, I don't know if I can keep all this in my head, that's a really good recap and just a way to, again, get you started with a simple chant tone. I think he uses the same chant tone that we did for our first one that we'll be doing in our services because it is a really simple one to start with. The next link down, St. Dunstan's Plainsong Psalter YouTube videos. This is the second one that we just chanted with the pneumatic writing. If you are like, I don't know how to read that, but I still think it's really awesome, there's actually, someone has put the entire 150 Psalms, they each have their own video from this St. Dunstan's Psalter, and so that's someone who's gone through and set all of these Psalms to different tones, and the text appears scrolling on the screen, so you can actually chant along with it, and you'll hear somebody singing it, and so you can just join in as you get comfortable with the tone, and the text has those alterations to it so you know when to move. So if you're like, I need a lot more help to get into this, but I really want to, I would highly recommend that to you. And it's just really beautifully chanted as well, so a lovely thing just to put on if you want some psalm chanting on in the background to get it more in your ears. That next link, the Nashoda House Plainsong Psalter. This is a psalter set to modern notation, and it's a really wonderful thing that you can use. They have all of the tones that they use in that psalter. They have a piano recording of those on a YouTube playlist. So that's a great way, again, if you know the number of the psalm tone that you want to learn and you just don't know what it sounds like, you can see if it's available there. And then some psalters to consider, that St. Dunstan's, the Nashoda House that I just mentioned, those are both wonderful psalters, and I have the St. Dunstan's over on the piano if you want to take a look through it. I don't have the Nashoda House Psalter with me, but it's a really wonderful resource. What I do have is the St. Bernard Psalter, which is actually also published through Nashoda House, and it has several of the same tones. I really love, that's my favorite Psalter right now, and I love using that because it's written out for morning and evening prayer. And all the morning prayer psalms, if you're reading through the whole Psalter in 30 days, all your morning prayer psalms for day 1 are chanted to the same tone. So you don't have to think about switching tones for every psalm. You can just learn one in the morning, settle into it for 3 or 4 psalms, and then a different tone for your evening ones, and then the next day it changes. And I think they only use the 16 most common tones and endings, and again, a lot of those have the same start, and only the ending is a little bit different. So that, to me, is the most accessible way if psalm chanting is new to you, but you want to explore it some more. I'd be happy to show you that St. Bernard Psalter. And then the Plainsong Psalter is our resource through the Anglican Church, and so that I find that one a little bit harder to follow along the way the symbols that they use and the way the text is altered. Seems a little bit less intuitive to me, but if you want to look through and just see another way, it is written on modern notation, but it uses different symbols to show you where the different parts of the tone change and how to do that with the text. So those are some really wonderful resources, and I'm happy to talk to you more and point you in the right direction beyond those links if you want to look into that. But I've been talking and we've been chanting, and I want to open it up to any questions in case some things here are not making sense.
You just mentioned the psalters, and I wondered which one do we use for our liturgy?
That's a great question. I don't believe we have a psalter, so like a musical setting, because we just use that one psalm tone through all of Lent, and so we have just that. The music is printed out, you'll see in the bulletin, and then we just bold the text, or underline and bold, I think, the text. So we kind of have our own system for showing you when to change. And then I think we just use the Book of Common Prayer for the actual text, the translation of those psalms. That's a great question, though, because different psalters use different translations. Both of what we chanted today are from the Book of Common Prayer, from the Coverdale translation, the original, and also the New Coverdale translation. But the other psalter I was mentioning, the Plainsong Psalter, is actually a different translation, and so that's another wonderful way to encounter that text differently, even if you're still chanting the same song. Other questions?
Is a strong symbol the same as where it would be accented?
Yes. Yeah, so you're really, a great way to kind of figure that out if you're just looking at one psalm is to just speak it through And even with a pencil, you can go through and just go, where's the stronger syllable near the end of this line, and just underline that syllable with your pencil, and that'll show you when to inflect your voice. Yeah, great question. Any others?
Oh, I arrived a few minutes late. Your name and your experience
Yeah.
might draw you to interest in this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Kacy Henley. I have a background in music, so I have a piano performance degree and a worship arts minor, although I did not encounter song chanting at all in my studies. I've encountered that solely through the Anglican Church and through being parts of parishes that used it. So I'm largely self-taught, but I've been able to be in communities that incorporate it, and there's such a wealth of resources, especially with the internet. So YouTube has been my friend, as well as other people who know how to do song chanting. So I said at the beginning, I'm by no means an expert in this field, and I'm not a professional singer either by any means. But what I love about song chanting is it's meant to be accessible to communities and to people who have all different degrees of musicality. And so I don't think you need to be an expert to enter it, or even to be able to teach it to someone else. You just need to do it and develop some comfort with it. Other questions?
Me again.
I'm thinking that some of these, like St. Dunstan's, maybe they have recordings, because I'd love to listen to some of them.
Yeah, so the St. Dunstan's is the one on YouTube that I know they have the whole entire Psalter, which is just such a great resource. So even though that Psalter, because of the pneumatic notation, I think it's a little bit harder to get into if you're just trying to open the book up and do it on your own. If you have that recording with you and you just try it out a little bit every day, because of having that oral resource, it's a really, really accessible one, actually.
Thank you.
I often tell my students that poetry is the marriage of sound and sense. And just listening to all of you, I love how chanting the Psalms can illustrate so powerfully that interplay. So Kacy, just thank you so much for your expertise. That was an erudite meditation. Beautiful to sing with all of you, and we get to do more of it in service. By way of announcement, just please come next Sunday, where Jean McAllister is going to continue this series on enduring practices by getting us thinking about journaling and how the written word interacts with Scripture and our apprehension of Scripture. And why don't I close this in a word of prayer? Heavenly Father, this is the day that you've made. We rejoice enough to sing and be glad in it. Thank you for this household of faith, Advent Anglican. I thank you for its desire to align itself with the word that you've spoken to all generations, and ultimately with the person of Jesus. You've set us free to go in peace as you've promised, Lord. For these eyes of mine have seen the Savior, and you have prepared for the world to see a light to enlighten the nations and the glory of your people of Israel. Glory to the Father, to the Son, to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.